This is NAFSA Worldview with Jenny Lee. I'm Melissa Watley, postdoctoral research scholar with the Belk Center for Community College Leadership and Research at North Carolina State University. Jenny Lee is a professor in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. A current NAFSA Senior Fellow, Lee's research encompasses a range of issues that center on the internationalization of higher education. Her research topics have included organizational behaviors, community partnerships, and student engagement globally. She is also the author of a recent essay titled The China Threat in U.S. Universities. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. Can you briefly explain what you mean by the China threat?
Absolutely. So the China threat is a term that's been around for a while, but has received considerable media attention since the FBI director, Christopher Wray, described this supposed China threat, which essentially is a repositioning on how China is being seen from an ally to a competitor, or some would even say as an adversary. How this applies to higher education specifically is bringing into question the role of China in intellectual property, the extent to which China may be involved in espionage, stealing intellectual property as spies, stealing what is supposedly belonging to the United States. And so this is a way that China is being constructed in our political environment as a threat to U.S. interests.
And why is China as a nation state particularly prominent in these conversations? And then how does the broader national political climate surrounding China impact higher education specifically?
So to answer the first part of your question, China is unquestionably a rising superpower, in many ways equivalent or perhaps even surpassing that of the U.S.'s position as a global superpower. So we see this play out, again, referring to higher education in terms of our publications. We are witnessing now China is producing more publications than the U.S., in scientific publications in particular, but also in regards to the rise in expenditures that it's spending in order to produce more research. Now, the United States is on top in regards to its impact, and that is measured by its citations. This gives us a way of understanding the influence that research has on the broader global community, on knowledge production. And while the U.S. is on top in terms of impact, China is anticipated to increase and to exceed the United States by 2022. So in that regards, China is now being seen increasingly as a competitor, a so-called threat, maybe less in regards to a possible cooperative partner, but more as a way that may put the U.S. in a lower position globally. And as that applies to internationalization, audience members here know quite well that the U.S. is quite reliant on China for our international students, comprising over 300,000 international students, a third of all international students coming from this largest sending country, but also providing considerable revenue, providing considerable contributions to science, as hopefully we'll get into it in a bit later. And what does that mean then when a country that we very much relied upon for most of our internationalization efforts is now being seen as a potential adversary within the interests of the nation state?
And what do you view as the most impactful or important consequence of this perception of China as a national threat within the U.S. higher education space particularly?
So there's the short-term and long-term consequences. Right now, university leaders, senior international officers are very much concerned about what will happen to university programming and partnerships with less Chinese students and scholars. So that's an immediate and important concern that's being addressed. But the longer issues that I've been thinking about and I think need more attention is how are these national security interests affecting the ways that universities internationalize, and to what extent are national security interests taking priority over the broader goals of higher education. And that means in regards to our knowledge production, in regards to the research that we do. You know, for the most part, we think about education as being borderless and helping global society and working across countries and international offices play such important programs in promoting these kinds of exchange and collaboration. But on the other hand, we're seeing increasing national security concerns regarding to countries such as China and how that might be curbing internationalization efforts. And I think a broader conversation that we should probably be having is, what does this mean for the role of universities, not just international affairs offices, but also the work that faculty do that cross borders and that is so important in terms of the knowledge that's being generated by our universities in the U.S. and across the world. I think that this also has important concerns in regards to the ways that governmental interests are starving and shaping higher education. So if I can expand on that for a bit, we are seeing a declining demand domestically for higher education. We're seeing that universities are increasingly having to rely on international students and scholars for not only in regards to low enrollment, but even an interest in pursuing STEM fields at the graduate level. So here we're seeing an increasing dependency financially, but also in regards to the roles that these students and scholars play in the good work that is occurring at these institutions. At the same time, we're witnessing federal legislative limits, political pressures, federal funding guidelines that are curbing the kind of work that we do and the extent to which we do it and the partners that we work with. So I think a real important consequence is what does internationalization for higher education mean? And I think the consequences for that are just as great, if not greater, than the immediate issue about possible fewer Chinese students and scholars coming to the U.S.
And so in your essay, you define neo-racism as racism that is justified based on a superiority of cultures or nations. Can you expand some on the concept of neo-racism and how that applies specifically to the situations of Chinese scholars and students who are associated or studying at U.S. colleges and universities?
So neo-racism is a term that I've written about for the past decade, so certainly is not isolated to the current events, but certainly does apply. So neo-racism is beyond traditional racism based on one's phenotype, but has to do with a sense of superiority of cultures that goes beyond the color of one's skin. So, for example, me as an Asian American, I am treated very differently than an international Asian student based on my accent, my dress, my mannerisms. And so that stereotyping goes beyond just the appearance of being Asian, but also having to do with the sense of what are the stereotypes associated with that person. And that also, neo-racism takes it even further to suggest a cultural superiority where nations are being positioned as being more welcomed and less welcomed than others. We see that playing out now in numerous statements that have been made by our current president about particular people from particular regions of the world, those that are welcomed and those that are not. And so this hierarchy of preferences for individuals based on their country that they're coming from is very much playing out now and certainly does apply to our students and scholars coming from China. Just to offer a few examples of that, we're seeing headlines being made about professors who are making these broad accusations against their Chinese students, very negative stereotypes. It's, these individuals have resigned or have been removed from their various positions, but certainly is not isolated to the few cases we're seeing in the news, but again, has been going on for at least a decade in the research I've done, not only in the U.S., but in different parts of the world.
And so also in your essay, you focus on the potential threat to the scientific community specifically. You write, with China positioned as an adversary rather than an ally, the potential for future innovation in addressing the world's leading health and environmental problems may be hampered. Could you expand on this a bit?
Absolutely. So the U.S., again, is well known as an important producer of scientific knowledge. And we are seeing a rise of publications that are collaborative across countries. The U.S. is the largest international collaborator of scientific research as measured by authors and their affiliations in different parts of the world. So the U.S. is on top, and this trend has been increasing, but its largest collaborator is with China, and China's largest collaborator is with the U.S. Mm-hmm. So amidst all these federal proposals and pressures to limit ties between these countries, there will be an effect in regards to the extent of scientific collaboration that is occurring. And we're not just talking about publications, although that's a measure that's commonly used, but also applies to the actual issues. We're talking about global health concerns, pandemic outbreaks, environmental concerns, wildlife management, renewable energy. And China and the U.S. have had this agreement to engage in bilateral research since the 70s. And so, again, that is being questioned. The extent to which these kind of arrangements will be renewed and continued is unknown, but these will be serious consequences beyond the interests of the U.S. or China's security, but in regards to some of the broader global issues that may not be studied in the same ways or the extent to which they will be studied collaboratively if these types of relationships are being limited.
What advice or recommendations would you give to senior international officers, others in the field, who have to respond to a political climate where Chinese students and scholars are perceived as threats?
I think mostly what we've seen from our major associations and university leaders is compliance, in complying with the FBI and complying with political pressures to help monitor, perhaps even surveil Chinese students and scholars. I think that universities as institutions of higher learning should actually be in the front end in talking about the contributions that these students make, not just that we rely on them for revenue, but the important work that they do and how we are able to maintain our status in being in world-class universities. The U.S. is a global superpower. Much of that is through the contributions of our immigrants and including our international students and scholars. And I think that universities, more than comply, need to be in the front end in advocating on behalf of these individuals. We've seen a few isolated cases of scientists possibly not following reporting guidelines, possibly being connected to China, and yet we have hundreds of thousands more that are being affected by these sweeping generalizations that they are spies and here with ill intent. And really, through my research and most of the work that's being done that I've seen, they really are coming just to make a better life for themselves and their families, to try to pursue a better education, hopefully even to obtain a position in the United States where they can earn a good wage. And I think that all of that is being lost in the broader political conversations about Chinese as spies. And I think that is really what universities need to be doing to dismantle these stereotypes, to inform the work, to educate the public and to educate policymakers on what our international students and scholars are doing and how they lead to the benefits of the nation state as opposed to taking away. I think that there is an unfortunate view that higher education or internationalization is a zero-sum game, and one is at the expense of the other. And again, I think that universities play an important role in educating the public on the important roles that these individuals serve.
And so how would you advise those working within international higher education on navigating the current political climate in their efforts to bring about internationally focused leadership, learning, and change on their campus and beyond?
First of all, through my observations, international affairs tends not to do enough assessment. And I know that that tends to not be an important priority amidst all the other functions that university international offices are engaged in. But it is crucial to understand what is happening with these students. What are the outcomes? That will not only inform the broader university and public of the benefits that they bring in, but also to advocate for more internationalization. And without this data, I think it's really important. It's one thing to rely on literature or to make political statements, but it's another to actually have hard evidence. And that's what universities do well, is that we're able to come up with hard evidence to support our proposals, to justify our activities, and to promote the good work that international officers do. I think also in the short term, we also need to think about what do we do with this immediate supposed potential crisis if we have a dramatic decline of Chinese students in particular? And I think in terms of internationalization strategies, we also need to think beyond traditional mobility, international students coming as full-time students, but also transnational education that may occur across borders that may not require physical movement. I think that will also be an issue that we'll have to increasingly address. Should there be more restrictions on visas or students being unable to simply afford to come to the United States. So, for example, at my institution at the University of Arizona, we have what we call microcampuses, where we provide joint programs with institutions abroad so that international students, or they call them students in their particular respective home countries, can obtain an international education while staying at home, but still have the opportunity to engage and learn from instructors in the United States. We also have branch campuses, we have online programs and degrees. And so there's many other ways that transnational education is occurring, and the current political environment may require us to think outside the traditional box.
And do you have anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
I think that it's important in the current environment and pressures about having to surveil supposed spies within our institutions. It's important to know that security protocols already exist. Sensitive research already requires various stages of approvals in order for researchers to be engaged. So for institutions to suddenly decide that they are covert arms of the FBI to monitor our students, I think is going to do far more harm for many innocent casualties in the process. And I fear that is where we're heading unless we act now, but also with the knowledge that we have, with more research, with more assessment, for universities to speak out more on behalf of our international students and scholars, and to advocate for actually more internationalization, which again is against what the current legislative proposals, the proposals that are being made are limiting that. And I think really for the U.S. to maintain its place as a superpower, internationalization is absolutely essential. So whether that's the intention, the interests of the nation state or broader global society, I think that internationalization really answers to these multiple issues that are being addressed today. And so limiting them would perhaps ensure our decline, but rather we need to be thinking about ways that we can promote even more internationalization effectively and creatively.
Thank you again for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me.